So Cal,
Thank you, Ray.
the ACC is one of the oldest trade associations of its kind, dating back to 1872. I won't ask you what's changed in the past century, but I mean, what do you see some of the key changes in the past decade? How has the ACC and what it's focused on changed?
Yeah, Ray, well, I've been there for just almost 10 years, and there's just been an incredible amount of change just in the last decade. And that's what I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about, how the United States chemical industry has gone from a high-cost producer of chemicals to now among the world's lowest producers of chemicals. But what has also changed is a little bit of the political environment. I also had the opportunity earlier in my career to spend 7 terms as a member of the U.S. Congress. I retired in 2004. And I retired because even in 2004, the political environment was getting a little too contentious for me. And now, when you look at the elections we have today, and there's going to be another 5 states are going to vote in the presidential primary, I mean, if I had engaged in the type of rhetoric and the political discourse that we see some of our candidates engaging in today, my mom wouldn't have even voted for me. So we have a very changed political environment, regulatory environment, but this industry, the chemical industry in the United States, has one of the greatest opportunities that we've had maybe since 1872 or whenever it was we started the American Chemistry Council. So thank you, Ray, very much.
Excellent.
For this opportunity.
Thank you, Cal.
Thank you. Yeah. I did mention a little bit about the political environment, and we talked a little bit about the political discourse. My mom wouldn't vote for me if I had said some of the things that some of the candidates would say, but I always had a challenge trying to keep a lot of my relatives to vote for me because I was a farmer in the Central Valley of California. And if you know anything about politics in the Central Valley of California, most farmers are overwhelmingly Republican in their partisan affiliation. And I was a little bit of an outlier because I was a Democrat. And I was born and raised about a mile from where my dad was born and raised, which was about 3 miles from where my mother was born and raised. So all my aunts and uncles and cousins lived very, very close to me. And they were all farmers too. And I had this, when I was running for my first election, I had this one uncle that kind of epitomized a redneck Republican. And I was really challenged to convince him to vote for me. So I gave him my best campaign pitch. And he said, after I finished, he said, Cal, he says, look, he says, I've only voted for one Democrat in my life, and that's when I was on a jury, and I voted to hang him. So I went to Congress as a Democrat that was highly motivated to try to find ways to bring people together. And Tom, in his opening remarks this morning, talked about how you're all here today to try to figure out how we can work together to provide solutions. Unfortunately, we have a culture in Washington that isn't quite as focused on working together and drive solutions. But I've had the great opportunity over the last 8 years to be part of just what is just a terrific industry that you're all a part of. But we're probably one of the industries that might be one of the least understood and certainly least appreciated in the entire United States, if not globally. And the American Chemistry Council, our mission is really to try to advance a regulatory environment that allows you folks to deliver bottom line value to your owners, to ensure that you're providing for your employees, and also to ensure that you can bring forward the products that your customers and in-use consumers need. We have about 85% of the companies that manufacture about 85% of the industrial chemicals in the United States. We also reach down into our partners, the shippers and the suppliers that are also members of the ACC, which we have about another 80 of those. We're very proud of what we are doing on behalf of the industry, again, to ensure that we have the opportunity to, you folks can excel and capitalize on the wonderful advantages that you have. Ray mentioned what has changed in the, in the history of the American, or the chemical industry. When I took over at ACC 8 years ago, part of my job is to go around and speak to all the members of our board, which are generally the CEOs of the largest chemical companies operating in the United States, or the presidents of the North American affiliates of some of our international companies. 8 years ago, when I went out talking to these CEOs, very few of them, if any, were talking about making major new investments in the United States. And this chart pretty much sums it up because it really shows that change in competitive advantage that I spoke to. If you look back in about 2005, you have the United States, which was at the top of this competitive curve. We were that high-cost competitor. If you look at the decade before 2005, our industry lost about 25% of our workforce. As companies were searching out for more stable and less expensive feedstocks, they were also chasing customers in some cases, but we saw a major offshoring of chemical manufacturing from the United States. And if you look at that competitive chart today, we are now towards the bottom where we are, or towards the right side of that curve, and that we have now become one of the lowest cost manufacturers of chemicals globally. And you all know the reason for that. It's really been the changed energy dynamic, where we now have the United States, which has one of the largest supplies of natural gas as well as oil, and that has contributed to the United States chemical industry being maybe the most competitive in the world. And it's a competitive situation that we're absolutely convinced will be sustained, because when you look at the certainty of the supply of natural gas, which is our feedstock. And the reason why this is so important is that 75% of the chemicals that are manufactured in the United States use natural gas as their feedstock. And about 85% of the global production outside the United States use oil. And so when we see the fact that we have low-priced natural gas, which we think will be around for a long time, that is leading to a flood of new investments. And we keep a running total. We have calculated right now that we have about $164 billion in new investment in chemical manufacturing coming into the United States. And it's about 40% of this $164 billion is already completed or near completion. Another 50% of the balance of that $164 billion is in the planning and the permitting stage. We are confident that you're going to see this $164 billion, even with the volatility and the decline in oil prices that you've seen to date, that will continue to be followed through and invested in the United States. What is also very, very important about this is 61% of this $164 billion is foreign direct investment. And if you're in my job, which is to be one of the chief advocates for the industry, when I have the opportunity to go to members of Congress and state legislators and governors and tell them that we are an industry that is seeing a flood of new investment, and it's a flood of new investment that is inshoring. We are seeing an industry that is creating more jobs. It allows us to deliver a message that we are one of the critical underpinnings of a renaissance in manufacturing that needs the regulatory policies and the support of our regulatory agencies at the state and the federal level to ensure that we can maximize this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. I'm going to be attending the IHS conference. It's in Houston here just a little bit later today and tomorrow. And they're focused a lot in terms of what is happening with this kind of volatility in the oil and natural gas prices. We do a lot of work with IHS, but they are absolutely convinced. And we have some critics out there in the industry that are trying to say, oh, well, this volatility is not going to, it's going to create such uncertainty. You're not going to see this new investment in chemical manufacturing. We think nothing could be further from the truth. Because these investments that are being made are made on the long term. They're made on the confidence in terms of what is going to be the long-term competitive advantage. And we are absolutely, again, convinced, as IHS is, that we have a 30-year supply of natural gas that can be extracted at no more than $4 an MTBU. And we actually think with this decline in oil prices, you're seeing the enhanced technology, which is even going to drive that production break-even or profitability point even lower. And when we calculate just what that means to the overall economy, this about $164 billion is going to manifest itself in about $113 billion in annual additional chemical output. And when we model that in terms of what the broader contribution to the economy and jobs is, this is going to result in about 807,000 new jobs that are going to be created in the U.S. economy, and is also going to contribute on an annual basis another $322 billion. And that's where we really can make a compelling argument that where our industry is in the supply chain, We are the foundation for a renaissance in manufacturing. And when we talk about this flood of new investment, it is not solely and not primarily to serve the domestic marketplace. It's really, coming here to serve a global marketplace. And we also have done the work in our extrapolations is that we're going to see an increase in our balance of trade and net exports that's going to go from about 19 billion currently to about 48 billion by the year 2030. We're going to see a 30 billion increase in our net exports of chemicals in the United States. And far too few people understand today that the chemical industry, we comprise about 14 cents of every dollar of exports is in fact chemicals. We are one of the leading exports today, let alone what we're going to be able to do in the future. Now, part of, again, is my job too is, okay, we got this tremendous competitive advantage because of our feedstocks, our energy, is how do we ensure also that we also create a competitive advantage on the regulatory front? And we have never seen, I think, in recent times, certainly, such a divergence between some of our competitors in Western Europe and the European Union, and even some other nations throughout the world, in terms of their energy policies that they're embracing and the energy policies that we're embracing in the United States. I mean, you look at Germany. I had the chance to be over at the Davos meeting, and Kurt Bach and some other of the big leaders in the chemical industry were talking, and they're talking about the energy policy in Germany, which I applaud them in moving towards the alternatives and renewables, but turning their back on nuclear. You look at what is happening there. In the last 5 years, Germany's emissions have actually increased as they decline their production on nuclear, and they're importing coal from the United States. You got France has banned fracking. You got some other Eastern Europe companies that have done the same thing. And when you start looking in terms of that competitive advantage longer term, we have an opportunity if we put forward common sense policies in the United States that allow us in an environmentally responsible way to produce the energy and the feedstocks that can really provide, again, the opportunity for us to capitalize on this economic opportunity. And when you look at some of the leaders in Europe, and part of my job, I represent the American Chemistry Council, so I can take some little shots at some of my European counterparts here. But when you have the European Industry Commissioner who made the quote, when people choose whether to invest in Europe or in the US, what they think most about is the cost of energy. The loss of competitiveness is frightening. And Jim Ratcliffe's statement, he wrote a letter to the president of the EU Commission, and this was one of his quotes that he had. He's the chairman of INEOS. Chemicals depend on competitive energy and feedstock costs. It could well become another European dinosaur. So again, part of our message, and you got some of my more liberal colleagues or former colleagues in Congress that actually kind of look to the EU and think, maybe we ought to do what they're doing. And we're coming back and saying, nothing could be further from the truth, is that you can advance common sense policies that respond effectively to the environmental challenges that the world is facing, the United States facing. You can advance common sense policies as they pertain to the assessment of safety and chemicals in commerce, and you can do it in a smarter, more efficient way that will ensure that the United States will continue to be at the forefront of the economic development of the chemical industry. So in the American Chemistry Council, we focus on a few. These are just a few of our issues. And one of them gets to that comprehensive domestic energy policy. It's a little bit disturbing that on the Democratic side, you've had Bernie Sanders at a debate a couple weeks ago, and I was elected the same year as Bernie. I will say this, he is intellectually consistent. You got to admire him for that. But he is so intellectually consistent on the far extreme that it is really kind of frightening. And his comment that he made at the Michigan debate was that he would ban fracking. And you kind of go like, what are you talking about here? But that was his statement. He also, then Hillary Clinton felt like she had to somewhat respond to that And so she effectively said, well, I'll ban fracking on all public lands. And when you look at the amount of public lands we're producing oil and gas on, it's significant, certainly in the West. And then she would impose a set of regulatory issues in terms of methane emissions, et cetera, which she said it would effectively ban emissions. You know, fortunately, we have been able to build a broader political support for, again, environmentally responsible energy production that Hillary Clinton or Bernie Sanders aren't going to be successful. And a lot of that strategy that's been deployed by ACC and our upstream partners has been able to focus to ensure that most of the regulations are implemented at the state in terms of how it pertains to the restrictions on energy, natural gas, and oil production. So I think we're over the tipping point there, although we're going to have to continue to be attentive. We also have to ensure that EPA and some of the regulatory agencies are putting in place the permitting processes that give the certainty that when a company makes a decision in their boardroom to make a $5 billion investment in a new cracker, is that it can be brought online in a timely fashion. And we're making some progress on that. And the other issue on the tax issue, this is one which we're going to see, I think, become center stage in the next year. I had the opportunity when I was in Washington just yesterday to meet with Paul Ryan, the new speaker, and he is a tax expert. This guy is incredible. And you know, what we have to be worried about, again, from a chemical industry perspective is that we are very capital intensive. We're making huge investments in plant and equipment. That $161 billion, every dollar that's invested today benefits from an accelerated depreciation of somewhat. And that is a critical calculation in terms of whether or not, you know, many of those boards are making the decision to make that investment in the United States. And so we have, though, a need for us to ensure that we move to a more territorial tax system, that we reduce our corporate tax rate. Because a lot of you have been following a lot of the, the decisions by some companies who, in order to enhance their global competitiveness and are looking at a 35% corporate tax rate in the United States, are engaging in an inversion where they're allowing a foreign company in some case, or company domiciled in Ireland or wherever else it is, to become the owner of that company through a series of transactions. You can imagine when you have Pfizer, a big U.S. company, thinking about moving to Ireland. You have other companies that have been in the press, a lot of them in the pharmaceutical sector. That is not a politically popular activity, certainly whether you're Republicans or Democrats. But it is also a call that we have to, again, reduce our corporate tax rate. But where the chemical industry has to be a little bit concerned is that the economic constituencies of the U.S. economy are not all going to be the same. If you look at the Googles, the Amazons, and some of the other technology companies, they have a lot of accumulated foreign earnings that are outside the U.S. They are not investing those necessarily in plant and equipment. They have a lot of free cash out there that they love to bring back into the United States, but they don't want to bring it back in at a 35% rate. But they would be willing to cut a deal, because it's primarily in cash, that will take a reduction from that 35% on our accumulated foreign earnings, maybe to 15%. We'll say that's a great deal. And so we will pay a repatriation tax on our accumulated earnings and cut the deal at the 15%. The problem with the chemical industry is that if you look at all of our companies that are domiciled in the U.S., when they're making their investments offshore, whether it be in the Middle East, whether it be in China, or wherever else, all that investment of earnings is going into plant and equipment. We don't have a free cash flow out there if you imposed a 15% tax rate. That 15% tax, which would be a new tax, retroactive tax, would actually be siphoning capital that is part of that $161 billion. So the challenge to us to ensure is that the chemical industry is joining with other manufacturing sectors that have a similar financial profile or investment profile to ensure that we're not isolated from some of the other political constituencies that have a lot of influence, be it Wall Street, the financial, the insurance, as well as the technology community, as when we engage in the reform of our tax code. Oops. Now, one other issue, and this is one that we have been working on a great deal at ACC. Actually, it's been since I arrived, we made this one of our highest priorities, and that's the reform of the Toxic Substance Control Act. This is basically EPA's assessment of the safety of chemicals that are going into commerce. It was enacted into law in 1976, signed into law by Gerald Ford. It hasn't been updated or modernized since 1976. It needs to be modernized. We have been successful in this last year to build a bipartisan support, and both in the House and the Senate, which is almost unprecedented. We had a modernized TSCA bill, which we think takes a very effective approach forward that will enhance the authority that EPA has to do a more effective job in assessing the safety of chemicals. That will also ensure that our chemical industry can continue to be on the leading edge of innovation and bringing new products to the marketplace. This bill that we put together and played a major role and had a great partner actually with the Environmental Defense Fund, passed the House by 398 to 1, passed the Senate by what they call unanimous consent, so it was out of vote. But only in Washington could you have a bill that passed 398 to 1 in the House and unanimous consent in the Senate that would still be struggling to get the House and the Senate to come together to resolve the minor differences so that they could then have final action on it to send it to the President's desk. Well, I'm pleased to report that in the last week, we finally had the House and the Senate working together to try to see if they can narrow these differences. And we're hopeful in the next couple weeks, we'll see that final product. And again, this is going to be another example of a contrast with the regulatory construct that has been in place in the EU with the REACH program. All of our member companies comply with REACH. But all of our member companies would acknowledge that the cost of compliance with REACH is excessive, and it doesn't show a significant return on enhanced safety. So what we have tried to put in place here is, again, is a model that will ensure that EPA prioritizes chemicals, that we identify those that pose the greatest risk. That's where industry, as well as the regulatory community, should be investing most of their dollars and attention to demonstrate that they can be used in some applications in a safe manner. And it's so important that we be successful in this front because we have a lot of the more extreme elements of the NGO community that are trying to advance more of a hazard-based approach that won't acknowledge that it's the level of exposure, the risk level, that is what we should be focused on. And that's where there's going to be a contrast between what REACH is doing and what we're trying to do with this modernized TSCA. Because we contend, and we're already seeing evidence of this, as REACH continues to be implemented, as they continue to focus on smaller and smaller volumes of chemicals, low-volume chemicals, the ones that are oftentimes the new chemicals that are being brought to the market, that cost of compliance is going to continue to rise, that it's going to stifle innovation in the EU. And again, we are confident that if we advance our TSCA reform, our model, we're going to have a model that's going to, again, give us a competitive advantage, that if you want to be at the forefront of innovation in the chemical industry, the U.S. has a regulatory structure that provides the same level of assurance to the public, our customers, the consumers, in the safety of our products, but it can be done in a much less costly manner. And what we're also going to be doing, and we're already engaged in some conversations with Brazil, with Taiwan, with North Korea, with India, that this is a model that is superior to REACH. Because what the EU oftentimes does is that they adopt a policy, you can see it with the GMOs, and then where they basically preclude their utilization within Western Europe, and then they try to market that to Africa and South America and wherever else. we're trying to ensure that we have a better model that we can market throughout the world as a counter to REACH that will, again, benefit the broader interest of the chemical industry. What is also important, though, is that the industry can demonstrate to the regulatory community, to our customers, to consumers, to individuals that are concerned about the environment, that we are good corporate citizens, that we are adopting the policies, whether in process safety, in product safety, or in security, that ensure that we are responding to the broader interests of the communities in which we operate, our employees, as well as the interest of protecting the environment and ensuring that our products are safe. We adopted the Responsible Care Program. It was really almost 27, approaching 20, almost 30 years ago, which has really been the industry's kind of gold standards in terms of the process or the practices that we try to encourage all companies in the industry. It's mandated if you're a member of the American Chemistry Council, but all chemical companies to adopt. And it gives me a lot of credibility when I can go into a member of Congress's office and try to dispel some of that perception in terms of the chemical industry. There's probably not one member of Congress that isn't surprised when I can go in and I can tell them that, do you realize that an employee working in the chemical industry that there are 6 times fewer accidents or work time losses in the chemical industry than there is in the manufacturing sector as large. It's actually, if you look at the OSHA data, it is actually safer to work in a chemical plant than it is to work in a Walmart. And it's through our Responsible Care Program and some of the process safety practices that we put in place and the data that we're able to collect that allows us to make that very compelling argument. Even when we look at emissions, there's obviously a lot of concern about how do we respond to some of the global warming. We don't try to debate whether this is just part of a natural cycle or whether or not there are contributions from all of our activities. But what we are clearly trying to demonstrate that our industry is trying to provide the innovations and the solutions that empower our customers, as well as, again, end-use consumers, to reduce their environmental footprint. We as an industry have reduced our emissions by 49% since 1972. We have reduced our emissions per unit of output by over 28% since 1992. We have a great record to tell in terms of the contributions we are making both on the process safety side, the product safety side, as well as our contributions with our own operations on achieving greater energy efficiency. But we also recognize that we have to play a role internationally. We now have 60 countries internationally that are embracing responsible care. And ACC has actually developed MOUs with India, China, the Gulf region to try to facilitate their adoption of responsible care. Because I think we all recognize when you have an incident such as just made the press earlier this year with lumber liquidators that elevates this issue of chemicals in a consumer product to the marketplace, it affects all of us. And so we have an obligation, and basically we have an interest, a vested interest, to do whatever we can to ensure that the protocols and the practices that are part of responsible care are adopted internationally. And it's this collaborative effort by a lot of our multinational companies working with associations that is trying to advance this internationally. We also are very proud of the work we've done with the security arena. I know you're going to be talking a lot about that here at this conference. The American Chemistry Council has tried to be at the forefront of that in terms of adopting a security code that's part of our responsible care program. We continue to try to build on that with our Chemical Security Coordinating Council, which is really allowing ACC and other sectors to work collaboratively with DHS. It's really with that credibility that we've been able to develop with DHS that also has allowed them to have the confidence in our security code that they have given us what they call a qualified anti-terrorism standard with our security code, which actually provides our member companies that are using the security code under responsible care, liability protection if there was an act, a terrorist act. There's only one other association in the United States that has this designation, and that's the National Football League. And so we're proud of this. And so, it's again, I think, though, is more than anything else is an example of the relationship and the partnership that we have with some of the regulatory agency. Bill Gullidge is here on my staff, which really runs our Kim ITC group, which we have about 38 companies that are kind of engaging to try to collaborate to find ways which we can enhance the security of our facilities. And they also contribute to our work that we're doing on the legislative front, where we had CISA that passed a little bit earlier this year. And this is a measure that, again, allows for the sharing of information, allows for the providing of information to some of the agencies out there, but also does not expose industry and companies to liability. A good step forward for the industry on that front as well. Now I'm going to close on just this kind of issue, because this also gets to raise a question in terms of how has ACC changed and how the challenges have changed. If I look back in terms of the greatest battle or challenge or policy that ACC has been involved in over the last certainly 50 years, it's really been this conflict between constituents that want to advance a hazard-based or precautionary-based approach to the assessment of safety in chemicals, meaning just the presence, not the dose, should dictate whether or not they should be banned from the marketplace, versus those of us who believe that you need to take a very consistent science-based approach, that you look and make a determination whether or not the level of exposure creates an environmental or health or safety problem. If you look back over the last few decades, that battle has been waged primarily in the regulatory arena, initially at the federal level. And we engaged at that at ACC. We really developed our in-house expertise and capacity to push back to ensure that we are advancing a science risk-based approach to assessing the safety of chemicals. We were very effective at the federal level. But then the challenge migrated to the state level, where we have something like 300 bills that are introduced in the states in the last couple years that were really trying to advance some type of product ban that was a hazard-based assessment, or even chemical management systems. So we have basically the NGO community that tried to win at the federal level, which we pushed back on, some of the extreme elements of the NGO community. They migrated to the state arena because we were beating them at the federal level. We have basically been very successful, again, in prevailing at the state level as well. And so the NGO community, again, that extreme elements, extreme group of them that are trying to advance this hazard base, they're looking for a new battleground. And when we look at where that new battleground is and where the industry, the chemical industry, has the greatest vulnerabilities over the next 10 years and maybe in the future, it is in the private sector. Because the NGOs realize that if they can go to the Walmarts and the Targets and convince them that consumers are concerned about the safety of the products that's on their shelves, that Walmart's going to respond. Because the NGO community recognizes that Walmart isn't in the business of convincing their customers that the products on their shelves are safe. They're in the business of meeting consumer preferences. And the NGO community, some of the extreme elements, they basically have a business model which is really predicated on exploiting fear. And it's not just an accident. The NRDC and EDF and some other of these groups have offices in Bentonville. They have offices there because they realize that Walmart has maybe become the most influential regulator, even more so than EPA, that we have in the United States today. And so what we're doing at the American Chemistry Council with our member companies is how do we develop an advocacy strategy that extends beyond the federal and state and municipal governments and moves into the value chain. And this is where we think we have the greatest need and where a lot of our focus is going to be even in a post-TSCA modernized world. If we get TSCA reform through, it will help us to have another argument to make that EPA now has more authority. They have more data to make those informed decisions in terms of the safety of these chemicals in the marketplace. That will help us with Walmart. But we also have to do a better job of building that coalition and collaboration with our customers throughout the value chain to collectively respond to what Walmart needs. Now, our concern here is, as an industry, we might have almost vacated the playing field in this area for too long. You know, we allowed some of the NGO community to develop their assessment tools that they have been able to market to some of these big retailers. And what is incumbent upon us, what we have learned, is that we have to provide a solution to Walmart. We just can't sit on the sidelines and say that Walmart wants to have some idea in terms of how they can respond to this perception of safety in the marketplace. It's going to be incumbent on the chemical industry to respond. We have some opportunities, though, because Walmart will tell you they're going to be concerned about the safety of chemicals that are on their shelves, but they're not going to sacrifice performance or price. And we have so many of our products that at the level of exposure that those chemicals are absolutely safe, and what they're contributing in terms of performance really responds to a lot of that green consumer's interest as well. Those chemicals are what are essential to enhancing sustainability and reducing emissions. And so we have a real challenge as the industry when we look forward, is how do we really engage in this value chain to ensure that we're a partner with Walmart, having the greatest influence in how they are making the assessment of the safety of the chemicals in their products. And it goes beyond Walmart. It goes to Lowe's, Home Depots, the sporting authorities, and all these different groups. So with that, I'll bring my comments to close. But the one thing I think also in the time that I've been with the chemical industry, and I didn't have a background in chemistry when they hired me. And they hired me because their focus was a little more on the policy side. I did tell them, though, when I was talking to them 8 years ago, that my daughter did graduate as a chemical engineer major. And when I went back home and told my daughter that, she responded, well, that just goes to show you there's deviation in the gene pool. But I think what we have here is an industry that is incredibly sound. We have an industry that is providing solutions that more people need to understand. We can look back to December when President Obama and leaders throughout the world gathered in Paris at the COPs meeting. When they made their commitment, whether they were voluntary or mandatory, thank goodness they were voluntary, commitments in terms of the reductions in emissions that they would try to achieve in those respective nations. We have the ability as a chemical industry to make a very compelling case that there's not another industry outside the chemical industry that is more essential, more integral to the ability of those leaders of those nations throughout the world to meet their reductions in emissions. It is our industry that is providing the insulations, the coatings that are contributing to significant reductions in emissions from buildings and residential space. When we look at the plastics and the composites that are going in lightweighting of vehicles that are increasing the miles per gallon and in essence reducing emissions. When we look at even on the alternative energies, when you look at a solar cell, it's basically chemicals. When you look at the composites that are enhancing the efficiency of our wind turbines, they're epoxy-based. When you look at all the innovations and the technologies and the new products that our industry is responsible for, we are really providing the foundation for the ability of nations and societies to really achieve some of their environmental objectives in terms of reduced emissions and sustainability. We have a lot to be proud of, but we also have to build upon a sound foundation of the best practices in the industry. And that's why I'm delighted to be here working with SAP and others and a lot of the conversations that you're going to be having throughout this conference, because it's going to take a collaborative effort to ensure that we can capitalize on the real competitive advantage we have in the U.S. in terms of chemical manufacture and make sure that we're being the best and responsible citizens